Yes, we are on. Hello, hi everyone. I'm Ramon here. Apart from my startup, I am the founder of Lean Startup Circle over here in Bangalore, and also organize it. We try to meet at least once a month and exchange notes and do some workshops with great guys. So today we have Justin, the author of the Traction book, and he'll talk about the traction framework and the most important channels which startups can use to get the traction. Justin, over to you.
How old am I?
No, no, it's over to you.
Cool, great. So basically, let me start with talking about why we wrote Traction Book. So, I think if you look at startups today, with the ready availability of cloud technologies and all of these different tools that make it easier for someone to build a startup, the main reason that startups today are failing is not because they can't build a product. Like it's not easy, but it can be accomplished much more easily and with fewer resources than ever before in history. And so the reason why you're seeing a lot of startups fail today is not because they can't build something, but it's because they can't get traction. And so we wrote a Traction book to give startup founders, marketers, and everyone a framework that they can use to when they go about the process of how to get traction. So much how Lean Startup gives you a framework of like, here's how you approach product development, here's how you talk to customers, and all of this. The Traction book provides a framework that you can use to get traction in the same way. So we call that the bullseye framework, which is essentially like we talk about each of the 19 ways a company can acquire customers. And then we dig into like here you how you rank and figure out what channels might work for you. And then you run a small test in two or three of the channels that seem most promising, and then double down on the ones that work the best. And so, like investors in the Valley and Peter Thiel uh, say things like most startups find one to two good distribution channels, and that just propels them to massive growth. And so we try and provide a framework around that you can use to figure out what your best distribution channels are. And then we do like a high level overview of each of the 19 channels that are available to any startup in the book. Does that make sense?
Justin, can you talk a little bit about the Can you just talk a little bit about the framework which you have designed?
Yeah, so the bullseye framework is, like I said, so it's a five-step process basically that companies, individuals can use to figure out what channels make sense for their business. So it is a process of looking at each of the 19 channels, and I can actually link to a post I did recently around this bullseye framework that might be good for you all to look at. But uh, basically, it's a process of looking at the different channels. That's step one, just like looking at channels, because a lot of times founders have biases against channels that they don't have experience with. So, like if you've done ads before, but you've never written a blog post, you may be biased to do more ads, even if posts could be more effective for your business. So, for example, so we talked about listing all the 19 channels, ranking them in terms of which ones make the most sense for your business. Like if you have a paid product, you're in the B2B space, you have a product you charge for, advertising could be a really good channel for you. If you're just trying to get users that you're not going to make any money from, advertising could be a little tougher because then you're spending money and you don't make any and all this stuff. And so you basically think through like, what is my scenario? How are my competitors acquiring customers? How much do I make on each customer? And then you rank the channels. So you'd say like you'll end up with a list of like 1 to 5 that seem the best. And then after you do that, you figure out, okay, what are some tests that I can run in each of these channels to determine whether or not this makes sense for my business. And so, that means if you had, let's say you had content marketing and advertising as two of the ones that you wanted to test. So if you had that, then you could run a quick test in advertising and say by $100 or $500 worth of AdWords and see how that performs. Do that and then write a really compelling blog post and see how that performs compared to AdWords. Like there's all these things that you can do, um, and then you like weight the different channels against each other. So this is like step 4. So you should have 3 to 4 tests done, and then you figure out, okay, of these tests that I ran in these traction channels, which ones did perform the best, and then can I double down on this channel? So if you had something where you got 1,000 customers from a blog post and like 500 from advertising, and the blog post costs you less than advertising, it may make sense to double down on the content marketing channel. So do more blog posts, advertise it more, just until you feel that channel gets tapped out, and then you go through this exercise again, figure out your next channel, and keep growing.
Uh, Justin, any best practices on experimentation and performing the tests?
Yeah, I mean, so would it be helpful if some people on here if you guys told me what you're working on, and I can get through and I can like talk through some specific tests to run, or just give me an example product that we can talk through? Because I think this stuff is better when it's more specific.
Natwa, do you want to ask a question about your startup?
Yes, I did not know that you actually just muted me. But hey, Justin, this is Natwar here, and I run a startup called Around.io. It's a social media marketing tool for
Hmm.
online sellers. And I have yet to go through the book. Ram and I were talking, but I've tested a few channels and I'm still not, I've spent time on content, I've spent time and money on ads. I don't think I'm really able to measure things very well because of this smaller scale. If I acquire 50 customers from one place, 2 days ago something nice happened, a blog post came out from a customer and that has acquired me another 50 customers for free. So I'm not really sure, like, how do you measure these things? And uh, I mean, if numbers make sense if they're in hundreds and in thousands, but in under 100, right? When we are still trying to get to traction, how do we deal with this?
Okay, great question. So you're at like less than 1,000 customers right now?
Yes, 500ish.
Okay,
Mhm.
cool. So what we talk about in the book and like just in general, what's useful at this stage is to figure out kind of what channels might make sense when you try and scale the business later on. So for a business like this, I'm on your website right now. It's a nice website. So I would say, yeah, so this is kind of like Buffer. This is kind of like another version of Buffer. Is that right?
It's buffer for people who sell online. So I integrate their online selling platforms and automate the stuff.
Got it. Okay, cool. Very cool. Yeah, so for these, I mean, so if you're still trying to get your first 1,000, then I would think that I mean, do you know like your prototypical customer, like the best person, the type of person that orders from you?
Yes. Yeah, the peer group has forced me enough to come up with a proper persona. Yes.
Okay, cool. And so what does that person look like?
So that person looks like that person has been selling for a while, good 6 months. They understand they have used at least another tool, and they do have over 40 products listed on whatever platform they are. So that's like the basics of my customer persona at this moment.
Got it. Okay, cool. So,
Mhm.
yeah, so it's something like this. So when you're trying to get your first couple thousand customers, so
Mhm.
I would look at how have other companies that are trying to get the selling online audience done this. And so if you look at Shopify, WooCommerce, um, let's see, there's some companies that do like Shopify add-ons and stuff. Generally, you see them doing a lot of outbound sales and
Mhm.
adding to like an add-on store. Or so like if you could look at getting into Shopify add-on store, becoming an Etsy partner, something like that. So business development could be a really good channel to test. And on the other hand, one thing that a lot of companies in this space do is just direct outbound email. And so I would look at like, okay, how are my competitors and other companies in this space acquiring users? and then kind of try and replicate that to get to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 customers. And then after you're at that point, that's when you can start looking and say, like, okay, now I have meaningful revenue coming in. Now I can start testing advertising or content marketing and see like which of these channels is more scalable and will work better for my business like long into the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is so. So I am partner at all the places, Shopify and Etsy. So you are saying that competitive study is definitely one of those things that we should pay attention to, or in the beginning, we should spend some time on. Am I hearing it right?
Sorry, say that again?
I'm saying so. The competitive study is another very important thing that we should be focusing on. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so at your stage, like, you just want to figure out however you can get to maybe 1,000 customers, because at that stage, it doesn't have to be a scalable channel. Like, maybe throwing a meetup for people that sell online in India could be a good way to acquire customers. Maybe just doing, like, sending an email to everyone that's doing online sales, talking about your product. Like, all of these things, they don't scale super well, but they're really effective in terms of just getting you like to 1,000 customers. And once you get there, then you have real revenue coming in that you can use to test other channels like paid acquisition, advertising, PR, doing SEO, like all these different kinds of things.
Fair enough. Makes sense. Thanks, Justin.
Justin, when we have so much less number of users to our website, so what do you think is the statistically significant data we can look up?
Yeah, so this is kind of hard. So you know how people, like, statistical significance is really difficult to reach. It's difficult even in science experiments with like hundreds of trials and all this stuff. And so what I try and do is like get to a point where you can reasonably see what is working and what isn't. So if you have an AdWords campaign, like maybe you spend $500 and no one ends up buying your product, or one person ends up buying your product. Like, yeah, it may not be statistically significant, but that's a good indicator that you may want to test another channel. So that's the whole thing with ranking this, is that, like, in ranking these channels, is that you should have a list of channels that you want to test. And so when you test one and it just gives you nothing, even though it may not be statistically significant, it's still probably a good sign that you should move on and try testing another channel that is in your that is on your list of things to play with, things to test, and things to do. Like in lean startup kind of methodology, there's not really interviewing customers and talking to customers. There's no real concept of statistical significance either. You know what I mean? So that so I think it's a common thing, like just when you're dealing with very small numbers, along the lines of figuring out your early customers, figuring out getting your first 100, getting your first 1,000 customers, it's just almost impossible to get statistical significance on any of this stuff. And so I just try and figure out, like, rational gut feel, like how does this stuff work? You know what I mean? And how likely is it that this channel, if you were to replicate these results and like multiply them by 5 or 10, would that be meaningful for you? And if not, then I just don't worry about it. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Jason. Yes, Jason. So, Arvind, you had some question?
Oh, it looks like I just got unmuted. Oops. So just a couple of quick comments, Justin. I'd love to get your perspectives on just a few things. One thing I noticed in the list of the 19 was guest posting. Mm-hmm. And from what I've heard, just with changes in how Google's algorithms work, the effectiveness of guest posting has apparently sort of gone down. Mm-hmm. I wasn't sure if you had any visibility to whether that's still popular, or people are using it. So that's part of one question. The second question I had was if you had a sense of, ultimately it's a startup, right? Like you're saying, a few years back, most VCs would tell startups, just pick one channel, right? Pick one channel, focus on it for a while, and then move on from there from one to another. Over the last couple of years, they've sort of been saying pick 2, 3 and work with those. And ultimately, you've only got so much runway, and um, you've sort of got to pick those battles a little bit. And maybe this is something that you cover in the book, but there's a framework sort of talk through how you choose those channels and how to sort of go about doing it. Because on one hand, you've got to get to you've got to run with one of the channels for a little while, so that, like Ram was saying, you need a certain sampling size for the data to be useful. But so it's sort of a slightly tricky trade-off, because content marketing, for instance, is a fairly longer-term effort, right? You end up investing in the blog, it's going to take a while. To try to bid with ads is likely going to be a little expensive. So, but even if we don't end up looking at CAC and LTV, ends up being a different sort of experiment. So to me, I think when I look around, I think we often end up grappling with trying to choose these. And you're absolutely right. I think we lean towards things that we're a little more familiar with or a little more comfortable with, even if those aren't the ones that might end up yielding the best success. But there's a bit of a catch-22 here, right? So I'd be curious to know if you've seen people who have worked around that.
Yeah. So as far as guest posting and Google effectiveness, I'll just start there. So really quickly, Google said basically it has less of an impact on your SEO, but that doesn't mean that getting in front of another audience doesn't work. You know what I mean? Like, even if it may not be great from an SEO standpoint anymore, it still works just because you're getting in front of another audience. If you can do a guest post and they mail it to their list, like, you know, they do all these things and they help you get in front of large groups of people. So that can still work, maybe just not for SEO. So that's as far as that goes. And then outside of that, you know, so you talked about VC saying, you know, one distribution channel, maybe two. So that is true. And so what we're just saying is that, like, in general, for when a company moves from like 1,000 to 10,000 users, oftentimes they just have one channel that is the bulk of that growth. And so we're just saying that startups don't think very strategically about marketing and growth. And so if you talk to like the average founder, a lot of times they'll just say, you know, you're like, oh, what is on your product development roadmap? And they'll name like, this feature is coming out, they want to build this integration, they want to just build out this massive thing. And then if you ask them what they want to do for marketing, they're just like, I don't know, like I hope we grow, you know, like it's not really thought through. And so all we're trying to do is provide a framework that startups can use to think through all these different channels. And then after that, the goal of these tests that you're running in these different channels is to see which ones perform best, and then you double down on that acquisition channel and forget about the ones that didn't work. So in practice, like after you run these tests, you should be focusing on mainly one or two channels that are really going to move the needle for your business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, Justin. The other observation I had was just looking at the 19, and I'm just sort of going through a slide share.
Yeah.
I apologize, I haven't had a chance to look through the book yet, but definitely it's on my list. And I think, to me, when I look at the 19, arguably some of these are suited to different stages at which startups would be, right, with respect to various stages they are, with respect to finding product market fit or growing from there. For instance, you have trade shows and offline events. And I presume some of these may be things that you had in mind for startups that are maybe a little further down along from a growth perspective.
Yeah, so how they think about growing?
Yeah, because these would likely be would be fairly involved, right?
Yeah, so we talk about that in the book as well, but there's this concept of like phases that your company is in. So do you know DuckDuckGo, like my co-author Gabriel's startup? So it's like a privacy-based search engine.
Right.
So early on, you know, he was running like small meetups and giving small talks to like privacy groups and people that wanted an alternative search engine. And when he was doing like several hundred searches a day, he would give a talk and he'd like see a little usage blip go up, you know. And so doing that event in the very early days made a lot of sense because he was like very, very early on in the business, didn't have a ton of customers, didn't have a ton of users, and so just doing anything that got him in front of a new group of people, like he actually was able to see an improvement in terms of growth. And so later on, like if he was to do that now, they're doing 5 million searches a day. He could give a talk anywhere in the world and it wouldn't make a difference to, you know, his traction. And so something that works, this is another concept we talk about, is just that something that works at one stage of your business is unlikely to work later down the line. And so now, you know, so Gabriel was like looking at doing these speaking events, going to offline events, and then once they reached a certain number, like in the tens of thousands of daily searches, he had to start all over and start looking at other acquisition channels. So that's when he started focusing on, he did some advertising, he did some like sharing stuff, he did micro sites like Don't Track Us and you know, the filter bubble and all this to get like his next several million users. And now they're focusing, so now like the micro sites and all that kind of stuff tapped out, and now they're focusing on partnerships, business development, and the like. So this is why I say that a lot of this stuff is highly dependent on what your business is like and what stage you are as a company. You know, like for the social media tool that we mentioned earlier, if he's trying to go from 500 to 1,000 customers, doing speaking engagements and offline events and that stuff could work really well. Once he's at 10,000 customers, that kind of stuff won't be as important, or it'll have to be a really massive speaking event, you know?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Justin. That makes sense.
What are you working on, by the way?
Working on a couple of little stealth products at this point. Again, in the social media space.
Cool.
I think there's a bit of a common thread.
Very cool.
Justin, according to you, what are the best channels for a startup to start with, in your experience? Best in the sense the cheapest and cheapest channels for a startup.
Yeah. So that kind of goes against, like saying like which one is the best kind of goes against this framework and the strategy that we talk about in the book. Because like the problem is that if you say like this is the best channel, everyone's going to start doing that, and it'll quickly become like not the best channel. You know, like maybe 6 months ago, a year ago, I would have said that Facebook ads are super underbought and it's really effective. But now Facebook, tons of people are buying Facebook ads, and so that doesn't really work. And so if you are trying to get your first like 10 or first 100 customers, I think by far the best channel, the best thing you can do is just direct outbound sales. So like emailing people that you know, pinging your contacts, asking your friends and family if they know anyone that fits your customer profile, and then just reaching out to them cold works really well. So it's hard to say just because it depends so much on how, you know, just on like the type of business you are, how much your customer is worth, all of these different things. But yeah, it's for sure the one thing that always works to get your first like 10, 20, 30 customers is just doing cold outbound email.
Hey Ram, I have a quick question. Ram?
Yes, no, go on.
Yeah. Hey Justin, you have spoken to so many people, right? And you have done this book. What in your view, and this is a sheer opinion that I'm asking, in your view, what was the best hack that you saw in last like 2 years that a startup has done to gain traction? the creative one, the innovative one, what would that be?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what phase do you want to know? Like to get your first 1,000 users, or to get your first, or to scale to like millions of users?
Let's take an example of both, if you could. That'll be very
Yeah,
nice.
sure.
Yeah.
So one of my favorites is before they launched. Have you heard of Mint.com?
Oh yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So before they launched, this guy Noah Kagan was their director of marketing, and so he went through this framework approach that we talked about. Like he tested a bunch of different channels. And then they figured out that one thing that worked really well for them was sponsoring blogs. And so what they did, and like you never see this done, is they basically sponsored single author blogs, like just a guy who had 30,000 users, to put up like a little banner on his site just saying, hey, mint.com is launching, they do this, it's awesome, you should check it out. And so that got them their first like 40,000 users in a very, very short period of time, like under a month. And so I think that was really cool just because that's like hustle, knowing your audience, and they did it very cheaply. So I love that. In terms of scaling to millions of users, this company called Evernote has done really, really interesting stuff in terms of building products to take advantage of large and emerging platforms. So what I mean by that is Evernote is a free app that allows you to record like anything you want, essentially. It's like a notepad, you can upload pictures, do all this kind of stuff. It's cool. So what they did is they charge like $20 a year or something like that, and most of their users are free. And so what they did is they focused on being first to any new platform that was coming out. So like they were one of the first apps on the iPhone store. They were one of the first apps in the Android store. They were one of the first apps in the Windows 7 phone directory. And so what this meant is like even though something like the Windows 7 phone didn't work, them being first in the App Store, in the Android store, and like that being their growth strategy meant that as those platforms grew, like their app grew with it, and that's how they acquired like 10 million users just by focusing on being first to each of these new platforms.
Well, that's amazing. Actually, that's very nice to hear. I did not know about that about the Evernote thing. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this dynamic exists in a lot of places, and a lot of people don't think about it. Where basically, if you are the first person or one of the first, people on a new platform, if that platform takes off, the people who join that platform are going to look to you, and your platform has an incentive to promote the people that are succeeding as it's growing. So, for example, like one thing I think is really interesting is you're seeing, like content marketing, blogging is really, really crowded. But what you're seeing work well is like the people that are getting quote unquote famous or like getting a lot of attention now are the ones that are writing on platforms that aren't as crowded. So like Medium, if you're a popular Medium writer, like I would rather, if you wanted to start a new blog, I would rather join Medium or LinkedIn Publishing or Quora Publishing than I would just starting my own blog and hoping that I can do the guest post thing like on my own, And so I think that there's for sure this thing that people don't talk about where being one of the early people on a platform that later grows is a really, really, really powerful tool, and it'll get you a lot of growth and a lot of attention.
Well, that's very interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Hey Rajan, you had a question?
Yeah.
Hi Justin, this is Rajan here. I work as a senior product manager for QuickBooks. I'm a practitioner of Lean within the company and also outside. So one of my questions was I was trying to frame the whole traction book, and I'm midway reading through it in the context of what customer development or Lean startup talks about. And I'm particularly fascinated by the various models that exist on the practice of entrepreneurship. That is, I'd like to call the lean as the Western world practice, and then effectuation that Professor Saraswati talks about as the Eastern world of practicing entrepreneurship. So I'm trying to figure out, in terms of practices, these are best practices. These are codified best practices. Now, where does it fit in? Is it to help folks go from 1,000 customers to maybe 10,000 or 10,000 to million? Is that where it kind of fits in, or is it about uh, a completely different way of thinking about coming up with ideas and taking them to success?
Yeah, so it's you know how like the lean startup framework is very much meant for everyone. You know what I mean? So, Eric Ries says that large companies, small startups, like all of these different types, all these different groups should be using lean principles in their work and building new products and the like. We are saying the same thing for traction. So if you are looking at growing in any way, you should be, like, no matter your size, you should be evaluating all of the different ways that you can grow. You should be running tests to figure out what acquisition channels are working for your business. And you should be doing a lot of things around figuring out just like what channels make sense for you, what channels people are responding to, all of that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so we think that this is truly one of those things that is important for a company at any phase, any stage to focus on, just because it happens so often that a new startup will launch or company will launch a new product and it just doesn't go anywhere. And that's just a function of the traction not being there, unless a function of like these companies building really poor products. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, so the focus seems to be around channel and figuring out in a methodical way which channel will the value proposition scale on. I mean, before the channel, you do some basic validation on whether the value proposition is going to work for a segment that you identify, and after that, methodically figure out which channel is going to help you grow. Is that how would you put it? Is that what I heard from you, sir?
Yeah, so it's kind of. So basically, it's not about like mentally figuring out what channel is going to help you grow. It's about narrowing down like 2 or 3 channels that you think would work for your business, and then running tests in those channels and seeing with data like which ones are most effective in terms of driving users. And so where in lean these concepts they roughly translate to talk to your customers, build the MVPs and all this stuff. Like we're kind of talking about building MVPs for different traction channels. So like what is the minimum thing that you can test in order to get a sense for how well this acquisition channel is working?
Got it. Sense.
Feel free to like be more specific if I'm not answering your question. Like happy to dig in.
No, I think your perspective was useful. So when Ram does workshop, when I help out with him, so we talk about the business model canvas, and we say you start with an idea, you document your idea with business model canvas, and then we say that in the business model canvas, the most important thing to figure out is the value proposition in the customer segment, and most of the time we see pivots or iterations happening over whether you've gotten the customer segment right or the value proposition right. And then once you have a basic sense of that, then we figure out what are the channels to take those value proposition to the customer. And when we talk about channel, it's about how are you going to deliver the information about your value offering itself, and how are you going to deliver the offering, how are you going to sort of get paid for that, and what channels are going to work for you. Is it going to be word of mouth? Is it going to be, are you going to drop ship this? Are you going to deliver it online as a SaaS service? So then we get into those discussions. So I was trying to frame this. So in Lean Startup, we end up doing a lot of experiment for the value proposition box as well as the segment box. So what I heard from you was that once you've figured out, it doesn't matter how you get your first 100, 500, like you mentioned to network, and after that you have to figure out what are the channels that will allow you to get scale and traction being equal to scale. And there you have to be methodical about it. And there are 19 channels to test it out that has worked for different companies in different industries in different time periods.
Got it. Okay. So, yeah, so basically, I mean, obviously you want to have a sense of like what your business is doing.
Right.
And, you know, so the business model canvas and all of that stuff is excellent, and it's a really good way to think about what your business is going to do. And so I would suggest that it would be good, it would be useful to think through, you know, or to use the bullseye framework that we talk about in Traction Book to figure out at the early stages of, like, I know bullseye or the lean canvas has stuff around how you're going to get your product to market. So like that is, we're kind of using bullseye to like dial in on that piece that a lot of companies neglect or just don't do well. And so I think if you use bullseye canvas or the lean canvas and then the bullseye framework and traction to figure out how you're going to get your product from one part to another and figure out the value prop, that's when it becomes really valuable. Because when you use the two together, there's this kind of virtuous cycle of, you know, I'm testing an acquisition channel and I'm also testing a value prop, and then how does that feed back into the lean canvas I'm building? And so it just becomes this really nice cycle where you're learning about what traction channels work, you're learning about what messaging works, what positioning works, what people respond to, what types of customers are working. And so using those two tools together is a really, really powerful thing. And like we've talked with the guy that wrote Business Model Generation, and he's like a big proponent of what we're doing just because he finds that a lot of people struggle with this issue.
Got it.
You know?
Got it. Yeah. So yeah, certainly I think, you know, you answered my question.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Back to you, Ram.
So anybody have any other questions? Priyanka?
Sorry, I was talking on mute. Hi, Justin. I'm an early stage startup actually. We are in the B2B space, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about from a B2B perspective. Some of the customers who we'd look at are people like Cisco or Splunk or people like that, or Teradata. Most
Sorry,
of what I've heard is you know, more of the B2C and the social media space. So if you could talk a bit from that perspective.
could you say the first part again?
Most of what I've heard, or you mean, so we are working in the B2B space, and the kind of customers we look at are people like TIPCO or Informatica or Teradata or Splunk, people like that. So would you talk a bit from that perspective too?
Okay, so you want me to talk about from B2B standpoint?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is where all of my experience has been. So I've never done like a consumer-facing company. I've never done consumer-facing marketing. So yeah, so B2B, you want to talk like early stage or mid stage or what kind of phase?
Oh, we are extremely early stage.
Early stage, Justin.
Okay, perfect. So basically, early stage is very, very much like hustle and connections based. So, you know, if let's say you just built a product, I would spend a lot of your time to start with, like cold emailing people, asking for introductions to influencers and other people who face the problem that your product solves, and then trying to schedule conversations with these people. So there's this great post that Jason Cohen has about how he, you know, they were building WP Engine, and what he did is he went on LinkedIn and he emailed a bunch of WordPress consultants and just said, hey, like, I will pay you your hourly rate. Can I just get your feedback on what we're doing? And that is how he got his first like 50 customers, was just through these conversations he was having with these people who cared about reliable WordPress hosting. They cared about what the problem he was trying to solve. And so in B2B especially, Like it's really important to, if you don't have those relationships, build them, and then have like one or two friends, connections, like informal advisors or whatever that you can go to and say, here's what we're working on. How does this impact or affect or solve the problem that I think you have? And if they say it does, then that's like you should have your first customer. And once you get like your first 3 customers, and that's just through hustle and talking to people, asking for introductions, cold email. Once you get your first 3 customers at the B2B level, that's when you start looking to scale up. That's when you start looking at getting your first PR, going to meetups, going to news groups, like doing a lot of these things that don't scale super well, but work really, really well to get you your first like 50, 100 customers. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Like for context, so the last company I was at, we got our first 100 users just by building a tool. It was a developer tool. Building a tool, emailed like 5 friends that we knew that ran development consultancies, and then posted about it on like Hacker News and one other relevant blog that covered developer tool. And like that got us our first 50 users, So it just, a lot of it is like very unscalable, very hustle driven stuff. But once you get your first 50 users, once you get your first 100, first 1,000, that's when you start saying like, okay, I have a product that people want. Some aspect of my positioning is resonating with the market, and now I'm going to look to scale and like acquire more people and bring them into my product,
Okay. All right.
What are you working on?
Hey,
Hey Ram, I think you need to unmute
Rinka,
Rinka.
Justin want to know what are you working on?
Ram, I think you've muted him.
I'm sorry, I muted. So we're working at the intersection.
Okay, Ram, I think it's automatically getting muted. Rinka's thing is automatically getting muted, and we can see the message that it's getting muted from your end.
Okay, can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, Rinka.
All right. So Justin, we are working at the intersection of supercomputing and big data. And what we're trying to do is bring some supercomputing tools into big data. So we want to target customers who really have big data needs, and the people who fit into that bracket are people like crypto and Teradata. So that's the kind of directions we're headed towards.
Got it. And do you have customers so far?
No, we don't. We are working at enabling an open source piece of software, Hibernate. We have a couple of people who are extremely interested and would like to try it out once we have implemented it.
Okay. So how hard has it been for you to get to talking to people or finding people to chat with?
Very hard. Very hard.
Okay. So why is that? And what have you tried so far to talk to people?
So I reached out to quite a few of my friends, and I guess it's been within India. I've not gone out to the US. I think that's been one problem. And I think the other problem, like a lot of guys here will tell you, I'm more geeky than a hustler. So I think that's the other issue that I need to go over. But I think I've been making progress on that. So
Okay. Great. That's awesome. So, yeah, so, it can take a while. Like, getting your first people, especially in B2B, it can just take a while. Like, I would just be prepared to send a lot of emails, make a lot of calls, and unfortunately face a lot of rejection to get your first, 100 people on board. But once you get your first 100, once you get your first, like, 500, it becomes a lot easier to market and acquire new customers because they're not the first ones doing it. They don't want to take a risk. And because you actually have revenue that allows you to invest in things like acquisition channels, build out a better product, do a referral program, do all kinds of things. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Thanks.
I have a quick question, Justin.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through how did you go about going through the same bullseye framework for the book, right? You decide book is currently your product, right? Can you walk us through the thought process that you had?
Yeah, for how we marketed the book.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, so have you seen, so the book's done really well so far, which is exciting. So basically our stuff worked, which is good. So yeah, so that's a great question. So we started and we looked at like, okay, we're selling this book for $15. It's now $10 because Amazon's discounted it. And so, so we're not making very much on every book sale. Like we intentionally wanted to price it low so that we could get more people who would buy this. So we looked at that. We're like, we're not making much money on this, which means that we can't do advertising. So like, can't do AdWords, can't do display ads, can't do Facebook ads, can't do offline ads, can't do any of these things. And so we talked to a couple other people who have launched books and just said, like, what worked in terms of moving a lot of copies for you. And every time we found that it worked when people wrote guest posts on other blogs, when people had those guest posts emailed out to other audiences, and then lastly, when people did speaking events and offline events where you could talk to people in person about the book and sell the book in person as like part of a ticket. And so that's what we focused on. So we're 9 days into launch, and what we focused on is doing guest posts. We have been emailing our lists. We've been having other people email their email subscribers and just talking about Traction Book, like the problem it solves, all of this. We got on Hacker News and some other Product Hunt and Hacker News. Like we focused on, because they just have large chunks of people that are interested in startups. And then the last thing that we've just started lining up is we have a bunch of speaking engagements lined up where we will go to an accelerator or to an event and give a talk. So, and generally events will say, hey, can we pay to have you give a talk, or will you just come by and do a talk? And for these, we'll say, yeah, we're like happy to come by, but if you can buy 200 books and just bake it into the price of a ticket for anyone that comes, we will 100% be there. And so that's how we've been able to move, more than 3,000 books in a very, very short period of time, which is really cool. So it's been a combination of those things, but it's worked really well for us. And so we figured out early on, guest posts, email marketing, offline events, and speaking engagements were going to be our 4 channels to focus on. We ran tests, like we emailed our list, that worked really well. We had a couple guest posts that worked really well. And so I think we did a guest post on like almost every relevant startup blog to this point, except for one. And then now we're focusing on speaking engagements and offline events. Now that the book is out and people know more about it, it'll be a better way for us to sell books and to get in front of more people.
So yeah, that makes perfect sense. And this is like one of that stage of the startup, right? When you're getting 1,000 customers or so, right? So
Yeah.
now the Traction Book as a product has to go to let's say 10,000 customers or 100,000 customers. So what's the thought process now? Because you already have that first stage figured out.
Totally. So with books, it's a little different because if you're building a company, every customer, after you get like 1,000, you go to 10,000, the value of that company increases exponentially between 1,000 and 10,000. With Traction Book, like if we sell 10,000 copies versus 100,000 copies, the value of Traction Book is not that much greater. You know what I mean? Because we make the same on every book. There's no like acquirable asset, so it's not like a huge thing. And so what we're going to be focusing on next is really the speaking engagements and the offline events, because we've hit pretty much everyone we can online. And so what needs to happen now in order for this to be big is giving talks at large events, like all over the world, like Pirate Summit would be a good one in Germany, like some of these really large startup events all over the world. That's one big one. And the second big thing is just like, honestly, hoping that we've built or created like a really good book, which I think we have. Like earlier reviews have been amazing, but just hoping that it's good enough that people like tell all of their friends about it, and it just keeps growing as something important into the near future. And then outside of those two things, we're also going to be testing building up the community. So we have like 6,000 people on our email list. We have a bunch of people that are going to be reading the book and talking in the forums. So we're just going to be testing like, what can we do to build up that community and keep traction at the forefront of people's minds, you know? It's a great question.
Cool. Thanks a lot for sharing that. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Justin. Others, you have a question?
Yeah, hi Justin, I'm Adarsh, and myself and Abhishek, who is also on the call, are working in an early stage startup called Indra Systems. And my question is almost in line with what Rinka was asking. So we are also a B2B based startup, focused startup, and our target customers at this moment are small and medium enterprises. So we have one paying customer in India, but we realize that probably earning $1 outside India is a lot more easier than doing the same in India. So we have started trying to call, or rather, get in touch with US based customers, US and the Middle East and maybe Europe customers. So what would be your thoughts around how we could go about doing this, right? I mean, at the moment, all that we're doing is either cold calling or shooting off cold emails and things like that. Would you have any suggestions around that?
Yeah, so it's kind of hard. So I've never gotten like been in the stage where your first customers are people in another country. So I would recommend.
Customer is from India, and we're still continuing the targeting that customer segment. But while we do that, we also want to kind of look at similar customer segments outside of India.
Okay, why is that?
Well, for the reason that India is a very price-sensitive market, and as I mentioned, for us the customer acquisition cost is quite high in India, for the lifetime value that we get out of that customer. So hence we are looking at, going for lesser price-sensitive markets.
Okay, but how many customers do you have?
No, we have one paying customer at the moment.
Okay, so I mean, how expensive is your thing? And is it, so my gut reaction.
Range of let's say about $8 to $10K a year.
Okay, and so, I mean, my gut reaction is that a lot of times when you hear someone say, "Oh, that's too much money," you're either not communicating the value proposition well enough, or it's just not worth what you're charging. And so I would try and figure that out before you sell into other markets that you don't really have connections or like great awareness of, because doing cold sales into foreign countries is like really, really, really hard, you know? And so, especially at that dollar amount, it's a difficult thing. And so I would try and figure out, like, what is it that we're building, and why are companies in India not willing to purchase this? And once you figure that out, and once you get like maybe 10, 20, 50 customers in India, even if they're not insanely profitable for you, you've at least like validated and learned that this is a product that some number of people want. And then you can take it to another country. But like if I'm making a business decision um, in the US whether to use a product, like I'm automatically going to be more likely to use a product that is started in the States and like is cheaper. And that's especially true if someone is saying like, oh, we only have one customer, and they're in India. Like the likelihood that I think companies in other markets would buy a product for spend 10 grand on a product that only has one customer is like seems very, very low to me. You know what I mean? And
Right,
so
right. So what
I
we
would
are
just
actually trying is to see if we can get partners to kind of get interested in the product that we have, because it's more like a plugin on top of a ERP. So we've had a couple of ERP vendors interested in talking to us, and we're talking to them. But so essentially, that's the channel that we are kind of exploiting at the moment.
okay. So have you seen that work for companies at your stage? Because in general, when I see companies that have done well with ERP partners and being like add-ons and stuff, a lot of times they end up being later stage than than not, if that makes sense. Like I very rarely see um, I very rarely see like companies just start out, become an ERP partner, and then just blow up. A lot of times it's like they start out, they have some number of paying customers, and then they transition and then use that as like a scaling channel and not to get their first 10 customers.
So are you recommending that we actually get more customers here in India before we even attempt to look outside? Would that
Yeah.
be okay?
Yeah, I
Got it.
mean, because otherwise it's like a hard sale. Selling internationally is hard in general, and it's even harder if you only have one customer in your home country. That's like what I think it breaks down to.
Got it. Yeah, yeah.
I hope that's not disappointing.
Justin?
Yeah.
Good morning, Justin. My question is on a very similar line with what others asked. So, actually, the reason we went with a partnership route, it's not exactly cold calling in Western side of the world, but we are looking for a partnership route, and we are partnership with well-established company. So ours is a value-added plugin. It's a core technology, and we are trying to get engaged with multiple ERP players in Western side and Middle East. But that is one of the channel that we are trying to explore, because this particular channel, the partnership channel, has worked for us in India. We partnered with one of the ERP company in India, and we got amazing inbounds calls.
Mhm.
So that's the reason that was the behind thought process which motivated us to go take the similar route, to go to Western market and Middle East market. But I would like you to tell us, in such kind of situation where it is a core technology, it's a B2B, what could be another way to go forward and explore more segments and geographies when you only have one customer?
One customer, how do you explore new geographies?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I don't know. When you only have one customer, like I don't think that you do explore multiple geographies, to be honest. Like I think that when you only have one customer, you're still trying to figure out like what does this customer like about my product? What value are they getting out of what I'm doing? What value are we providing to this group? Like how much are they willing to pay us? Will they talk? I mean, are they willing to talk about like tell us tell how awesome we are to other customers? Are they willing to act like as referrals? Like there's just a lot of things, a lot of questions that I think you still need to answer when you only have one customer. And so my goal, even in B2B, like one customer is a great start. I would still be trying to figure out you know, how to get 10, 20 customers before I start looking at international.
That's perfectly fine, Azan. We are looking in our geography within our country, and we are getting good traction. We were just exploring, one of our peers from Lean Startup Mafia Group, when they suggested that because it's a core technology and India is not a tech savvy country, and more than that, it is little price sensitive. So we should be parallelly exploring US, and that is the reason. Meanwhile, we are doing outbounds here in our local country. We are getting good traction here. We are almost on a piloting stage. We are parallelly doing the US, exploring US and Middle East countries.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, so India may not be like a tech hotbed in some ways, but there are certainly tech companies there. So what, can you get in front of them and talk to them about your product? Like, I would try and figure that out.
I see what you're saying. That's right. That's one good way to think through it and understand how we can talk to them.
Yeah, because there may not be a ton of them, and they may be a little harder to reach. But I mean, you could try doing outbound international sales. That just seems really, really hard to me when you have, very few customers and like not a lot of proof that what you're building is something someone wants in India. I could be totally wrong on that, but in my mind, that just seems really hard.
Sure. Thank you. I think I got the answer. Thank you, Justin.
Sure.
Thanks. If you want to give any closing comments.
Yeah. So basically, first of all, I appreciate you pulling this together. This is awesome. It's really cool to see like what you guys are working on and hear your questions. So, closing comments. Obviously, I think that the book can help a lot of companies at various stages. And so, if any of you get a chance to read it, like I'll type in my personal website. Would love if you could just shoot me an email and let me know your thoughts. Like, would be happy to chat and be as helpful as I can. So, yeah. So thanks again for hosting this, man. This is fantastic.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks a lot. Actually, I am half the way, so I have completed 5 chapters, and I would definitely recommend it. And everybody has to read these guys.
Awesome. Sounds great. Appreciate it. That's awesome.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you, Justin. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, likewise. Take care.
Thanks, Justin. Bye.
Bye.